Thanks everyone for joining today's webinar. We'll be starting shortly.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Lauren Lichten, and on behalf of the webinar subcommittee, I am excited to kick off our 2021 webinar series with a group of fabulous students who have been such a source of light during a challenging time for all humans, including genetic counselors. Welcome to today's webinar, Anti-Racism in Action, Genetic Counseling Trainee Platform for Racial Justice. We can advance to the next slide. Just to review the logistics of today's presentation, as a courtesy to our presenters, all attendees have been muted. We encourage questions to be asked throughout the presentation. Please utilize the Zoom chat box to type your questions for the presenters, and we will use the last 10 minutes of the webinar for our panelists to answer them. Next slide. Today, our learning objectives are to first define the history, mission, and organizational structure of Genetic Counseling Trainee Platform for Racial Justice, or GCRJ. Second, to discuss the challenges, insights, and successes in a community-centered grassroots organization. And three, explore how genetic counselors can incorporate anti-racism into their work and considerations for teaching and supervision. Today, we are joined by five members of GCRJ. First, Gianna Petrelli is a second-year student at Vanderbilt University with research interest in geospatial barriers to assessing clinical research. Next, Rashna Raza is a first-year student at UC Irvine and a member of the GCRJ Outreach Committee. Smriti Singh is a second-year student at Emory University, interested in prenatal counseling and minority patient outcomes in genetic services. Sophia Horan is a first year at Sarah Lawrence College, interested in pediatric counseling and equity in genetic services. And finally, Melissa Gandhi is a second year at Rutgers University, interested in cancer genetic counseling, healthcare, and genetic literacy and equity. Next slide. None of our speakers have any conflicts of interest related to the content of today's presentation, although Melissa Gandhi is a consultant for Generosity. And now I'll turn it over to our fabulous presenters.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Lauren. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the origin of GCRJ and our origin story. So May 25th, 2020 is a year that I'm sure everyone in this webinar will never forget. And on May 25th, 2020, Minneapolis police officers arrested George Floyd, who was a 46-year-old Black man, father, son, friend, and uncle, after a convenience store employee called 911 and told the police that Mr. Floyd had bought cigarettes with counterfeit $20 bill. 17 minutes after the first squad car arrived at the scene, Mr. Floyd was unconscious and pinned beneath 3 police officers, showing no signs of life. And he had become another victim of systemic racism in the United States. So as we all think back to this time earlier this summer, I'm sure that many genetic counselors and genetic counseling students marched in Black Lives Matter protests this summer, but also many have been fighting for racial equity long before the summer's revolution and long before the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other Black individuals that have been victims to racism in this country. But unfortunately, the genetic counseling field is not immune to systemic racism, and medicine is not immune to systemic racism either. The field of genetics itself has foundations in eugenic ideologies that can cause harm to not only our patients of minoritized backgrounds, but colleagues, peers, students, and coworkers of minoritized backgrounds as well. So realizing this, and as many people do in tough times, a couple of genetic counselors took to Twitter and kind of relied on the GC chat community. And we were thinking during these times of, we had one main question, which was, what can we as trainees in a predominantly white field as it currently stands do to educate ourselves and continually work towards being an actively anti-racist person, provider, and colleague, not only during, but beyond our training? We know from the 2020 NSGC professional status survey that over 90% of genetic counselors are white. And so because of this, we think about our patients who might walk into a genetic counseling office and their genetic counselor is not from the same background as them. Their genetic counselor might have cultural differences from them. So how can we expand access to culturally competent care and become more actively anti-racist? So we knew something had to be done in order to create this space specifically within genetic counseling trainee communities to specifically focus on anti-racism. And we know that so many programs, genetic counseling programs in the US incorporate anti-racism and cultural awareness into their curriculums. But we really envisioned a platform that specifically focused on anti-racism for genetic counseling trainees. So as I said before, we took to Twitter and asked that question, and there's a lot of responses that people wanted to talk further about this, and people really wanted to see change in action. So from there, we sent out a Google form where we asked who would be interested, and we had over 400 genetic counseling trainees interested in creating a platform like this. I think the exact number was like 416. So we collected all 416 emails, and from that we held preliminary meetings where some of the original members of GCRJ had 1-hour Zoom meetings over the course of 2 weeks, and we had 18 meetings total. In these meetings, we talked to over 200 genetic counseling trainees, where we asked open-ended questions about how our fellow trainees envisioned the platform working and what kinds of things they wanted out of a platform that was specifically focused on anti-racism in the genetic counseling profession. So from there, GCRJ was born, and GCRJ stands for the Genetic Counseling Trainee Platform for Racial Justice. We created our mission and vision statement based on these initial responses, which are as follows. So they're on the screen, but the mission statement is that the GCRJ fosters a community of genetic counseling trainees of all races, backgrounds, and identities that is grounded in becoming actively anti-racist. GCRJ was founded in response to the desire of genetic counseling trainees for a dedicated and open space to learn about our roles as individuals and future genetic counselors in the Black Lives Matter movement. GCRJ facilitates self-reflection, self-education, and community learning about anti-racism among all members. And as current trainees become rapidly integrated into the genetic counseling workforce, GCRJ aims to empower members to cultivate an enduring culture of genetic counselors who work towards dismantling systemic racism. And our vision statement is that GCRJ envisions a community of genetic counseling trainees that centers on lifelong learning and advocacy for a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce and approach to genetic counseling. So GCRJ was born from the work of a small group of GC trainees, but over 200 trainees, as I said before, participated in the preliminary meetings. And the preliminary meetings were what ultimately informed these mission and vision statements. And as the work in anti-racism is changing and constantly evolving, we plan to change and constantly evolve the mission and vision statement of GCRJ to best meet the needs of the greater community. So most notably, as I said before, it was really evident that trainees wanted this self-reflection, self-education, and growth in anti-racism work. For some trainees, this was their first time really confronting their own biases head on and really diving into anti-racism work. For other trainees, trainees have persevered through racism that's targeted at themselves or their peers throughout their lives. And so for this reason, it was extremely important to create communication guidelines that created a brave space instead of what we so often hear as a safe space. When we think of safe spaces, sometimes it could be implied that anything that's said in that space is okay to be said because it's a safe space. But what GCRJ really aims to do is create the safest space for our patients, our colleagues of minority backgrounds, and our peers. And so something that's said might not be safe for our patients or safe for our peers that are of minoritized backgrounds. And for that reason, we have these community guidelines to really foster a brave space instead of a safe space. So we encourage our members to think about things like impact over intent. So you might have had an intent of, you might have had different intent of something that you say, but the impact might be really charged with bias or racism. So thinking about how what you're saying could impact others instead of the intent that you had to say that. And we really actively respect all identities and aim to respect all identities. So we want all voices at the table for GCRJ.
Thank you so much for that recollection of our origin story, Gianna. My name is Smriti, and I'll be able to speak on some of the successes we've encountered and intentionally worked towards in our 8-month existence. So as Gianna has really spoke to already, GCRJ functions as a designated brave space with the clear intent of anti-racism training and dialogue in order to enrich our graduate training experiences. And this commitment really came about in a time of racial injustice and social unrest following the murder of George Floyd and other Black Americans last summer. And so this is really an intentional effort to change a moment into a movement and to continue to grow a space that trainees interested in anti-racism work can consult to, learn from, be present in, and contribute to. And so in our 8-month time, we've been able to do a variety of different activities and projects, one of them being cultivating resources. So a focus on both curating original resource materials, as well as highlighting some resources that have already been produced in combating racism in medicine. And so these are found on our website currently, and they undergo a pretty tight vetting and citation process that I'll talk about soon. Another one of our successes is our community-oriented leadership. So there's no formal hierarchy that exists within the GCRJ platform. We have about 20 to 30 consistent members that function to identify areas or subtopics of interest, establish events to promote learning, mentorship, or partnership, and continue committee goals. So the level of involvement from these members has largely been self-driven since the establishment of the platform, and individuals essentially self-select a committee to join and are placed in the respective Slack channel in order to work with their colleagues on committee-specific goals and intentions. So some of our current active efforts over the past 3 to 4 months have been a little more focused on growing committee leadership in order to pass on the responsibilities of committee goals from groups of trainees as they continue to graduate. Some of our committee work has included journal clubs, book clubs, jam boards, and prospective student events, which I'll highlight a bit more in detail. Another recent success was demonstrating our initial development and committee's specific work in our launch webinar back in December. So this was a great public appearance in order to generate feedback from GC trainees on what the audience would like us to continue to focus attention in, to clearly speak to our goals as a platform and allow for the broader GC community to hold us accountable, and to generate momentum within the trainee group as well as outside of the trainee group and not grow complacent as we enter our practice. We also have gotten some great recognition and contact from different professional societies to continue ongoing projects. Some examples include being touched base with NSGC regarding a blog post to highlight Henrietta Lack's story in celebration of Black History Month in order to specifically allude to some scientific mistrust and how we can shed further awareness on her story and how it's influenced the perception of the Black community in genetics and medicine. We've been in touch with the GC for Change Coalition, as well as the Virginia Association of GC's spring meeting in order to represent some of our work on their GEDI panel. And finally, we've been able to really operate and optimize our work by leveraging social media and online platforms, not only because we are in the middle of a pandemic, but also because our trainees are scattered across the country as well as Canada. And so this initial basis on technology allows us to be accessible with each other and have common areas to contain our information of interest to pull from. I did want to talk a bit more about some of our resource highlights. So we have a commitment to both highlight resources that are already well established, as well as generate some that are very specific to genetic counseling. And the following vetting checklist is something our resource committee has put forth in order to encourage trainees to be really thoughtful and intentional when encountering sources. So that can help encourage the greatest environment for reflection to take place. And as you can see, some of those questions regard authorship, if the message of the resource aligns with our mission and vision statements, as Gianna mentioned, if we're being completely present with those resources and recognizing our reactions as well as what we're taking away from those resources. So some examples include podcast recommendations focusing on concepts like genetic privacy, DTC testing, and who that serves or does not serve, personal bias, and how it can influence our outlook as providers, citizens, and humans. And so these resources are developed for the trainee use primarily, but it can definitely be used by practicing GCs as well. So beyond our resource committee, we have a host of different groups of trainees working independently in order to tackle anti-racism initiatives from many levels. So I'll just briefly touch on some of our committee work. Some examples that we've done in the past include Outreach Mondays and Let's Talk Thursday Slack threads to promote reflection and discussion, book clubs focused on TED Talks and articles. Our research committee has been working on making Spanish-friendly visual aids for review and use by certain labs, such as Ambry Genetics, and offering journal clubs focused on topics such as research into health disparities affecting underrepresented minorities. I'm particularly proud of our outreach committee. They've been able to go a step further and work on initiatives that are rippling past the platform. So establishing email campaigns to introduce high school students of minority backgrounds to the profession of genetic counseling, as well as our action committee, which was able to host a day of phone banking for the Georgia Senate runoffs last fall. And so this spring, a lot of our efforts are focused on paring down the number of events and engagement models and being really intentional with what we're putting out. A few weeks ago, we had a recruitment event to have members join our active committees, which is shown on the next slide, as well as some monthly jam boards to share thoughts on anti-racism, as well as a recommitment to this type of work entering 2021.
GCRJ is very proud of the successes we've had in our short time operating. We recognize our group's model also presents some unique challenges to accomplishing our work. GCRJ has no formal organizational hierarchy. This means no president, no committee chairs, no executive positions. We chose this model to promote equity within our group, so decision-making would come as a team effort rather than skewed in one individual or group's favor. This means that all projects thus far have been accomplished by a community effort on a volunteer basis. Of course, this model has some drawbacks. For one, there is no accountability, no reward or punishment for the work that committee members do or do not do. This leaves some projects, when not enough person power is behind it, to fizzle out. We've also seen gradual and sudden attrition of committee members who no longer have interest or time to contribute to GCRJ efforts, which renders projects unfinished and other members needing to pick up extra work. Additionally, we see the same handful of motivated people stepping up to work on projects. In our group of 500 members, a group of 20 to 30 individuals doing the heavy lifting is not sustainable. This disproportionate involvement creates an echo chamber of the same voices offering the same ideas, when we would really love to see more members with diverse perspectives contribute their thoughts. We hope this might change as the class of 2023 is welcomed later this spring. When it comes to our general membership outside the committees that execute our mission, there have been issues with engagement. While we are thrilled to have over 500 registered members, 300 of them on our Slack platform, we are having trouble with engagement and attendance. Again, there is no mandatory participation for members, so no incentives are promised for attending internal events or using our resources. It is completely self-motivated. We've seen low engagement present itself in empty reflection or discussion threads when we post conversation starters in our Slack channels. Unfortunately, we also find our original content underutilized after so many hours of committee members' labor and care. We're also realizing that when the white majority of our membership does not step up and engage, the hard work of self-education is falling on our BIPOC members. Next slide, please. To explore members' barriers to engagement, we administered a simple survey in November 2020. We did receive some specific feedback, including the desire for more intimate, small group discussion setting, rather than a Slack channel of 300 for sharing thoughts. We adjusted accordingly and made smaller focus groups for our journal clubs and other events. We made our monthly reflection prompts anonymous on the Jamboard site you saw previously. By and large, however, we received feedback that members are not engaging simply because they do not have enough time or are overwhelmed with all GCRJ has to offer. Of course, this is understandable. Graduate students and new GCs have a lot on their plate, like many of you in our audience. How will racial justice work fit into our packed schedules? Like most things, if it is important to us, we will make time for it, even 1 hour for it in our hectic week. I sometimes wonder, though, whether being too busy serves as a convenient excuse for possible other barriers to engaging in anti-racism work. Next slide, please. I implore our audience to consider these terms. Sit with the uncomfortable feelings. In recent times, you may have heard words like fragility and privilege used to describe the majority when they get too comfortable to care. For this group in particular, we must be vigilant of our good person complex. Yes, we help people. We may have mostly liberal views, but that does not make us an ally to those oppressed by the systems we work in. I encourage us all not to be bystanders to this historic call to action in our field. I commend everyone who made time for this webinar. This is a great step. One question that comes up often for people new to JEDI work, like our GCRJ team, is, where do I start? Next slide. This diagram was created by Ms. Deepa Iyer, titled Mapping Our Roles in a Social Change Ecosystem. We can zoom in, though, to our profession and center exceptional patient and client care in the work we do. Each person has a unique role in providing care aligned with their interests, passions, personality, and unique skill set. Genetic counselors can fill any and all of these roles. The caregivers go the extra mile to offer psychosocial support. The guides are training the next generation to become excellent providers. The disruptors are calling in organizations that have not yet recognized our scope of practice. Whichever role you fit, you are necessary in elevating the genetic counseling workforce to its best, with patients at the forefront. So when it comes to anti-racism work, where do you start? Next slide. You start where you are. Genetic counselors have a vast toolbox of skills that can be utilized in anti-racism work. You'll see now that our skill set can be applied to center equity, liberation, justice, and solidarity. The same builders who push for state licensure can apply their skills in institutional policy work that benefits patients of color and reverses racist policies. The same storytellers who engage in patient advocacy can leverage the use of social media to highlight the voices of our BIPOC colleagues and patients. Please do take time later to review the diagram and see where you might fit. You may even want to revisit introductory mnemonics like think and SMART goals to start ideating your work ahead. Through the intrinsic philosophy of our profession, valuing empathy, advocacy, humility, and accountability, we are so very well equipped to become actively anti-racist allies to our patients and colleagues.
Thank you, Rishna. I'll speak further about some ways we can engage with anti-racism training as we graduate and continue to practice. And so the first step is really that personal work and reflection piece. We know that racism exists on several levels: interpersonal, internalized supremacy. We see it in even some of the best intentioned organizations and institutions. And of course, we see it on a structural societal level. And so the commitment to this work does begin at an individual level, a cognizance of our personal biases and how our society can be responsible for some of them, and how it's up to us to do some of that unlearning. And so it's been demonstrated by many research papers that healthcare services take place in these misshapen, often unequal systems. And a commitment to this type of work is a big deal. It's just like our dedication to graduate training assignments, to our patients front and center, and to other professional enrichment activities that genetic counselors are constantly engaging in and championing. And so we want to offer some discussion on strategy in teaching and supervision roles that can not only facilitate personal work and reflection, but also help expand anti-racism learning into the spaces that genetic counselors already inhabit. We will walk through some of these examples in the coming slides. So the first resource I want to highlight is the Racial Justice Glossary that GCRJ has put together. So this is an ever-expanding document of terms in order to familiarize ourselves with discussions revolving racism in the context of genetic counseling. As Rishna mentioned, it can be difficult to understand where to begin, but starting basic with terms that allow us to really understand what diversity means and how it is different from inclusion, for example, or what we mean when we say we want justice-oriented programming, can serve to be beneficial for ourselves as well as the people we're conversing with. And this glossary also includes links to outside resources for further personal education. Some of the helpful beginner terms overlap with some of those underlying barriers that Rishna mentioned. And so, for example, being considerate of the difference between diversity, so the ways in which individuals and groups differ from one another, valuing those differences and how they contribute to society is a different idea than inclusion. So bringing in those groups that have been excluded or marginalized and having them share decision and policy making power. So we want to make sure that we're being really clear when we discuss DEI in a general abstract sense, but also in an action-oriented sense. I did also want to highlight an example demographics sheet that was put together by one of our members. So this can be a useful tool in supervision. We know that genetic counselors are key to our ability to train and interact with our patients effectively. And this sheet was designed to collect more accurate race, ethnicity, and identity information, as well as to promote conversations between supervisors and supervisees on the basis for collecting that data, how it is utilized, how it may influence testing ordered or counseling conducted. And this is an example of an educational tool that can be used in the classroom. So this is a bias worksheet focused on a case scenario, offering space for students to self-reflect with some guided questions, and can also be utilized to encourage small group discussion. Again, we know that addressing our biases can be uncomfortable, but these tools can be useful ways to have our students and ourselves get started. So one of my favorite authors is James Baldwin, and he has historically said to know your history. And so one of our key resources that kind of got us some trending attention in the beginning of our origin story is this timeline focused on a brief history of genetic counseling and racial inequity. These can be really useful tools to incorporate into your syllabus, especially for first-year students, introducing them to the field of genetic counseling, and a testament to the idea that racism is nothing new and it can be perpetuated if we don't take time to know our history and to make sure we're cognizant of not repeating similar mistakes from the past. One thing that I think is a little bit underrated, but I personally am trying to do more of, is to boost established organizations or initiatives that are already operating in the genetic counseling space. So amplifying the work of current counselors working on these initiatives, including BIPOC leaders, is absolutely essential. We cannot do this work without allyship. And in order to overcome some of that white fragility or discomfort that can lead to inaction, we can really turn to individuals already doing this work. This can especially be helpful if you're unsure of where your niche in anti-racism work is, but you can utilize your privilege, power, and skills and leverage it towards organizations such as MGPN and Black in Genetics. I did also want to highlight an example of anti-racism work on a more institutional level. So my personal MGPN mentor is a part of the DARE committee at University of Washington's new genetic counseling program. And she's been talking to me about some of the thoughtful initiatives they're undertaking in order to not only allow anti-racism efforts to ripple through their curriculum, but really be a core centered piece of their program's operations. So they've taken intentional steps such as removing the GRE for admission bases, developing a holistic admissions review process, exploring ways to engage BIPOC students, as well as diversifying faculty and staff. And there's a number of other points that the program lists on their website as well.
So thank you, Smriti. And we know that not all genetic counselors, a lot do, but not all genetic counselors work directly with a program and might not work within like a larger institution as well. So what can a genetic counselor do in their day-to-day work that might not be directly related to program work or directly related to a larger academic medical center's institution? So we like to think of this idea of calling up or calling in versus calling out. This is not something that GCRJ made. This is something that's been established for a few years, but it's the idea of how to stop racially or biased charged actions while they're happening. And before I talk about them, I want to preface it with saying that it does take a lot of courage in order to do both of these. And it also is a lot easier for someone that has a certain level of privilege to be able to do so. Calling up and calling out both can put a person in a very uncomfortable situation or could possibly put someone in an unsafe situation. So it's really important to know the avenues that someone has in order to call up or call out outside of the ones that I'm going to talk about. So for example, if your university or wherever you may be has an anonymous reporting system, it might be helpful to utilize that reporting system instead of directly speaking to the person themselves. So thinking about calling up, that might be talking to someone privately about a biased or racist comment that they made. So it could be, when your patient or a colleague's safety is not directly at risk in that moment. And it can sound something like, saying, I'm curious, what was your intention in saying that? Or how do you think your words would impact XYZ? And so it's really important to use that when there's an opportunity to explore deeper, to explore the comment deeper, to make meaning together, and to find a mutual sense of where someone was coming from and where there's a difference before you dive into how that's racially or racially biased. But then there's also calling out, which is this could be publicly calling someone out, and it is really important to stop someone in the moment. So this would be when you need to let someone know right away that their words or actions are unacceptable and will not be tolerated. As I said before, this is a lot easier to do if you're someone who has privilege. And we all know of situations where we've maybe gone back into a workroom and a provider shared something that was inappropriate or could have come from a place of implicit bias. Or a place of racism. And so in that moment, it's really important for other people in the room and the patient who's not in the room to stop the perpetrator in action. And so we think about it, when we need to interrupt right away in order to prevent further harm. And it's going to feel uncomfortable, but it will be necessary. And so we can think about calling up and calling out for a variety of different ways. This could be with labs that we order testing from. This could be providers that we work with. This could be administrators at the hospitals or wherever we may be, but utilizing these different ways to hold people accountable. And if you're the one person in the room who's not afraid to do that, can really help improve the outcomes for our patients and start to work further on creating an anti-racist genetic counseling community. So next we're going to have Sophia and Melissa both share some personal stories. And before they go, I really wanted to thank them for their willingness to talk about why they joined GCRJ and their motivations for doing so.
Thank you, Gianna. Hi, my name's Sophia. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why I joined GCRJ. This summer, when George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders caused a racial reckoning in the US, I felt a little lost. As a white woman growing up in a very white town, race was never at the forefront of my mind. I knew racism was a huge issue, but I didn't think it was my issue to try and fight. I thought, what could I possibly do to help? I thought, if this was such a big issue for underrepresented communities, that they would fight, and I would support them, but I wouldn't have to be at the forefront of any movement. This summer, I really began to educate myself, and I hate that I needed the Black Lives Matter movement to wake up and realize that I am part of the problem, but at least I did. It's hard to realize that. As someone who is very liberal and thinks of myself as someone who has always supported equal rights, and that's not wrong. I have always supported equal rights, but I have not always done something about it. This wake-up call really caused me to reflect on the profession I was about to join. But what could I do to make this overwhelmingly white profession more diverse? What could I do to make sure that I would be able to advocate for my future minority patients? Joining GCRJ was the first step. I am only one person. I can only do so much, and that goes for all of you too. By joining an organization that centers around racial justice, it has held me accountable to continuously educating myself on racism and genetic counseling and checking my biases when I'm in the classroom or in clinic. When news of George Floyd's death broke, I felt a lot of the reactions around me to be performative. I saw so many Instagram stories, and including my own, about racism and racial justice the days right after. but today I see one every once in a while. Organizations like GCRJ help hold me accountable for not letting my support be a fad, and that's why I joined. If any of you are wondering what you can do to take that first step, join an organization, read a book, listen to a podcast, anything that could challenge your everyday perceptions. But don't think that because you are white, you shouldn't be talking about race. And don't let whatever guilt you have stop you from taking that first step.
Thank you, Sophia, for sharing your story. My name is Melissa, and I fell in love with genetic counseling in college after shadowing a great group of genetic counselors and seeing the time, empathy, and advocacy spent for each patient. But like most things, you don't see the flaws until you're actually a part of that community. It started during the application process when I would go in for my interviews and meet the other applicants and see a sea of white. When I first learned about the 3 kinds of test results and how underrepresented populations are more likely to get a VUS because our genomic databases are still compromised of 95% European ancestry. And then when I learned about polygenic risk scores that were used in the breast cancer setting for patients who are at increased risk, but it was only available to patients who are white. All of these disparities made me feel frustrated, but I was unsure what I, by myself, could do. I was also under the false pretense that outright discrimination did not happen anymore in science or in the healthcare field. Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks were behind us, and how very wrong I was, because the subtle and implicit discriminations and biases are so much more insidious and have a greater impact on the care we give than we realize, which makes it just the more dangerous. After the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the revival of the Black Lives Matter movement, I did a lot of reflection and self-education on the privileges I've had thus far and what I can do to be a better ally in both my personal and professional life. And just a couple weeks later, I heard about this new group forming of genetic counseling trainees who are passionate and determined to make a change for the better. I attended the preliminary meetings in July and felt a new source of energy, but also hope. I've learned so much from my peers through our discussions and through self-education, and at times it was uncomfortable, but this is the time to be uncomfortable and make changes. I'm so glad I joined GCRJ because here we are, the next generation of genetic counselors who are no longer going to stand for the status quo and will make changes to make this profession more equitable and accessible to all. Thank you. We've also listed our contact information to our emails, and we also have our Twitter handle listed if you want to follow us on Twitter.
Thank you so much to our amazing panelists and all the members of GCRJ for not only presenting today, but all the amazing work you've done over this past year and serving as fantastic role models to many of us who've been in the profession for much longer. Makes me very excited about the future of our profession. This now leads us into the question and answer portion of our session. Participants, please feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom to enter your question. We did have one question come in regarding some of the resources posted and a lot of excitement about accessing them. So would one of you be able to comment upon how participants in the webinar would be able to access resources in the future?
Yeah, we do have a website where people can go and find our resources. I can put that in the chat so it's easier for people to find, but it's a Google site. It's sites.google.com /GCRJ, and I can just put that in the link as well, or Smriti just did. Thank you, Smriti.
Another participant asked if the recording would be available of this talk, and the webinar recording will be available within 48 hours on the NSGC website. Another question coming in says, thank you for your thoughtful and inspiring energy, which I hope will propel us all in this work. Can you suggest ways that we can apply your principles, considerations as we lift other forms of diversity, for example, gender identity, disability status, language proficiency? Again, absolutely gobsmacked at your work. And that's from Deepti Babu.
I can answer this one. So one thing that we had talked about is that, and Rashna kind of touched on this as well, is that when we're practicing genetic counselors or as we're going through our clinical rotations, we are always looking up what the patient's insurance is and always contacting insurance companies and advocating to get insurance companies to cover genetic testing and communicating with them constantly. And that's one aspect of a patient that we're constantly looking up and constantly working towards to get more equitable care for all of our patients. But that's only one aspect of a patient's whole picture. So taking that same sort of workforce that we use for advocacy skills for maybe the payer-provider communication, use it for provider communication for a patient's sexual orientation, for a patient's gender identity, for a patient's language needs. We have such a wide toolkit of advocacy skills that we probably use every single day for only certain aspects of patient care. So start to think about what other aspects of patient care can I apply that advocacy toolkit to?
The next comment and question was from Marianne Campion. Excellent presentation and such impressive work. Your comment and low engagement, especially as the group gets bigger, really resonated with me. Thank you for sharing some potential strategies, such as utilizing more small groups and encouraging new project leads. Do you have any other ideas about how to increase engagement?
I can add one comment. I think a lot of the times when people join groups like this, they think that it's going to be this enormous amount of work that they're going to have to put in. And so it deters people they join, but then it deters them from actually getting involved. And I think some strategies that we're thinking about trying to do is be like more straight up about how much work it actually is, because I mean, it's a lot of work for sure, but it's doable. Like you put an hour aside a week and it's very doable. So I think being more deliberate in how much time and letting people know how much time it would actually be to participate would be a helpful strategy. I don't know if anyone else has anything else.
I have a thought in regards to trainee perspective / trainee engagement. There are so many parts to our curriculum / competencies we have to master in graduate school. And if we have trainees, recommended by their professor in one class to attend one GCRJ event a semester and write a 2-page reflection, or to engage in a DEI book club of sorts for one semester's assignments. I think just natural incorporations and natural accountability in our curriculum can be helpful for trainees. What that looks like on a professional level, I'm a little more uncertain about, but if it has something to do with CEU accruement or certification, I think those are natural places to tie in strategy for engagement.
The next question from Tara Jones sort of follows up on that same issue of engagement. Her question is, can you foresee a way to increase accountability with a community-based group? I can only imagine how hard it is to give each person a platform with a group of over 300.
Thus far, definitely the accountability has been coming from within. I don't like letting my colleagues down, and I think that's something that motivates a good handful of us that have decided to take on projects. I don't know if we're in a place to offer incentives or like tangible motivations for engagement in the form of, I don't know, class credit or monetary gain. But that's something we can certainly explore. But like Smriti was saying, incorporating our work into classrooms can be a motivator because obviously if it's for classwork, a lot of students will do it. Whereas if it's for a group that has no bearing on your professional status or student status, it might be a little bit harder to engage and motivate people, but it's certainly an area for exploration.
The chat has a lot of interesting questions. There's a lot of excitement about your work with some questions from prospective genetic counseling students and practicing genetic counselors about how they can get involved or how they could support your work.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit more about what practicing genetic counselors can do, and just to kind of repeat what my fellow peers have said, but to start utilizing and starting conversations at your workplace about inclusion and how to be better advocates for our minority patients, whether it be using one of those resources from the website or just starting a simple conversation about, hey, you know, this event happened, or what can we do to make our patients be more comfortable? And they could go as simple as maybe changing the intake form and maybe having preferred pronouns. It can be as simple as that.
And to touch on for prospective students, we did have some events specifically reaching out to prospective students as well that they're very welcome to join when we reach out to them. As of now, we specifically are for genetic counseling trainees, and their prospective students that are soon to be genetic counseling trainees are automatically welcome in as soon as they match.
That said, we do share a lot of our resources on our Twitter and our website. So if you're interested in reading the things we're reading, we have those available for you to take a peek into the conversations we're having, even if you're not engaging live with us. So feel free to check those out and stay abreast of what we're doing.
The next question is from Rachel Nussbaum, who is feeling called and energized by your actions and proud to have such efforts in our community. Would you be able to address how you've handled resistance from genetic counselors who may not be at the same level of awareness on diversity and inclusion work?
I can say that, you know, a lot of genetic counselors are good people and they want to help. So I think it starts with a conversation, and it doesn't change with one conversation. I think the resistance comes when, you know, that one conversation doesn't do anything and they're like, oh, but, you know, I'm still a good genetic counselor. I'm still, you know, I am a liberal. I don't you know, have discriminations, but then having repeated conversations is one way to handle that resistance, and bringing it back up and bringing in resources, I think, helps.
I'll also add that I think, you know, really unfortunately in the field of genetic counseling, there's oftentimes, you know, we think about making a bigger table instead of building like a taller wall, but there's oftentimes situations where genetic counselors are at the table and they're all from a very homogenous background, or there's not a lot of diversity within a small group of genetic counselors that are working together, maybe in the same clinic, maybe in the same geographic location. And so if you're looking around at your peers or your colleagues and you're noticing that it is like a rather homogenous environment, being the one to not have to focus on the minoritized individual to bring their voice to the table, but instead being the one to amplify their voice. They're always bringing other voices to the table that are different than your own and different than the voices that are at the table with you, especially if you're, looking around in the clinic room or looking around on the clinic review call and thinking that no one else is really talking about different cultural aspects of the patient, not being afraid to be the one to make sure that that's present. Because if someone's resisting these conversations, it's probably because they are okay with being in their comfortable space, but that ultimately leads to implicit bias. So being the one to bring just a little bit of discomfort to the table to people who have never faced these things before can be the kind of start to changing that resistance in someone else.
Absolutely. And I want to add that obviously GCRJ is not the first to come up with these ideas for our profession specifically. We are absolutely standing on the shoulders of giants. So we encourage our audience at large to listen to their colleagues who are obviously well established in the field and have put in so much work already to improve JEDI efforts in our profession. We're learning from them and should continue to.
I think this will be our final question, which is from Janet Williams. Very nice presentation. Are there some important ways that graduate programs can begin to address safe, brave spaces for current trainees and programs to become more inclusive in outreach and in the admissions process? So if you could answer that in the next 4 minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, I can touch a little bit on this question. So in regards to generating safe, brave spaces, we know that inclusivity falls along the lines of what Gianna was mentioning earlier, this call-in culture. So really being cognizant that engaging in formation of this space is going to maybe cause certain resistances from how staff already operates or introduce ideas that were unanticipated. And it will take some restructuring and reforming. Making a brave safe space and like checking it off a box is completely different than committing the level of personal and community work to generate that space. And so I think making sure that if a graduate program is interested in outreach and making DEI initiatives infiltrate into admissions, that they're being really thoughtful. And then going back to another point Gianna was mentioning, making sure that the table is as representative as possible, or that the table of individuals is willing to address their personal bias and willing to recognize that it's going to be a little bit messy and it's going to introduce groups that usually don't have, autonomy in decision making.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just to go off of that, I think one important thing to keep in mind is like, it's great to always ask for help and ask people like what their thoughts are, but we want to make sure, like, especially as white people, and so many of us are in this field, that we're not like putting that burden on BIPOC people in our field. It's like, it's not fair for them to have to do all the work when we should be the allies as well. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're doing this stuff.
Well, that we could probably talk to all of you for hours. You have so many fantastic ideas about how we can all be better as a profession. Your email boxes may fill up with people wanting to lure you to work at their institution post-graduation after today. This concludes today's webinar, and on behalf of the entire NSGC webinar subcommittee, I wanted to thank you all for speaking with us today, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. This webinar recording will be posted to the webinar page of the NSGC website within 48 hours, and have a great day.
Thank you very much, all. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and warm.
Thank you.